Hello friends, Patrick here again, continuing my review of the book by Lawrence Krauss, entitled The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, and with the subheading of Why Are We Here? Last video we covered 7, 8, 9. Today's video is going to cover chapter 10, 11, and 12. So in chapter 10, he discusses, he uses a scripture again to start the chapter from 2 Timothy. It says, I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Funny for a guy who's an atheist to use that. It doesn't contribute to the chapter at all, except perhaps in his own mind. So in chapter 10, he discusses the discoveries by Fermi and things like Pauli, the exclusion principle, a new field called statistical mechanics, and all these wonderful discoveries of physicists and about the decay of particles and turning into other particles to help explain what they've been discovering at a subatomic level. So it's very interesting physics. It's quite delightful to get a little bit of insight, even though it's very difficult for me to absorb it since I'm not a physicist. But for the layperson, it is quite enlightening, and to gain a slightly better understanding of physics is quite pleasant and enjoyable, I must say. So I'll give him credit for that. But at the end of this chapter, chapter 10, he says, so the weak interaction, although extremely weak, nevertheless is largely responsible for our existence. He's talking about these different forces, the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetism, magnetism force, the force of gravity, and so on. And he comes to this conclusion, and he just pulls that out of thin air. He doesn't relate how that's the case. He could just as easily have said the weak interaction, although extremely weak, nevertheless is largely important when discussing the physics of subatomic particles, right? It goes with it. It's not responsible. So this is the first time he tries to answer this question, why are we here? And according to the author, he's saying, well, it's because of these weak interaction forces, which are obviously invisible to the human eye, but this was responsible for the protons and the neutrons and the muons and all these other little particles that they keep coming up with new names for, and they're smaller and smaller, and keep explaining how one decays into another one and the different charges that they have. I mean, it's all very fascinating indeed, but it doesn't explain the question of why are we here. It simply gives detail about our existence. It gives detail about our reality, for sure, but it does not contribute one iota to why are we here. For that, we have to go to the explanation that the teacher taught us, right? The explanations that he referenced in ancient scripture. And Genesis 1 so far lines up with everything they're saying here. God created, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's the explanation. That's why we're here. But he never addresses that. He tries to do everything possible to come up with a different explanation, but he never even addresses the question. That's why I said in my last video, he's not even wrong. He just is unable to address the question with what he's studying. He's studying a portion of our reality, which is difficult to see, is very, very interesting. He's studying, the standard model of subatomic particles, right? The standard model of physics up to what they've developed up to this point in time. So we move on to part 2. It's called Exodus, and chapter 11 is entitled Desperate Times and Desperate Measures. He quotes from Ecclesiastes again, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose. He admits that up until this point that he's covering in the history of science, that physicists have often been more confused than inspired. I'm surprised he makes that admission here. He introduces a gentleman by the name of Hideki Yukawa, and this gentleman from Japan was a brilliant physicist, and he came up with the idea of these additional particles, called mesons. I guess he called them mesotrons, but then another physicist said, well, let's call them mesons to be a little more precise, and how these mesons decay into pions and muons, and so on and so forth, about all these different particles that they introduce to help them explain the behavior of, atoms, protons, and neutrons, essentially. And so, yeah, Heisenberg told him to call it a meson, not a mesotron. So this brilliant physicist, Yukawa, came up with these different ideas on how particles decay and their relationship to electromagnetism based on their positive and negative charge, so on and so forth. Again, once the author gets into discussing actual physics, it's a brilliant book. It's really amazing that the depth of knowledge that this gentleman has on all these discoveries since 1905 until today, all through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and 60s. This guy knows the history of physics probably better than anybody on the planet. I bet better than even Lisa Randall. So very, very impressive stuff. Let's move on. Chapter 12, March of the Titans is called. He quotes from Isaiah, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid." This scripture is used often to deny the coming of the teacher in AD 33, because they say, well, the wolf didn't lie down with the lamb and the leopard didn't lie down with the kid, so this prophecy didn't get fulfilled, and so on and so forth. I'd have to take another video to try and talk about that particular scripture and what it's referring to, what it might be referring to. But needless to say, the teacher did come and teach us a lot of things, but it's easy for the enemies of Christ to pull out a tiny sliver of scripture and say, see, this is why it can't be such and such. Well, it would be like me pulling out a statement from a New York Times article on physics and say, see, look at, they don't know what they're talking about. Come on, it's anyway. So he talks about the period from 1954 to 1974, and during this time, he says they went from confusion to confidence, from ugliness to beauty. So during this 20-year period, they made huge strides in the understanding of particle physics, right? Interesting that he takes a dig on page 152 at the political right, saying that people that are oriented to the political right would rather prefer the good old days. It's a backhanded slight at, obviously, conservatives, Republicans, people that are right-leaning in their political views. He obviously wouldn't give them the time of day. This gentleman would be a Democrat, a liberal, a left-leaning individual by his own admission, right? I don't have to assume it, because since he's bashing the right, he's obviously putting himself on the side of the left. But that's only I'm assuming there. Okay, well, I'll let him deal with that. So he talks about the developments at the University of Chicago. He introduces this astrophysicist Subramanian Chandrasekhar, and the calculations that he did about why the sun is able to last as long as it is estimated to last, millions and billions of years instead of just like maybe 10,000 years, based on these calculations that they did about particles, the lifespan and the decay time, and so on and so forth. Fascinating stuff. Again, talking about these subatomic particles. So if you're a physics aficionado, or you want to understand more about all these little particles, and then he gets into the topic of parity, right? Interchanging left and right, and why that is so important when dealing with these subatomic particles. Extremely fascinating. Wonderful reading that part. Like I said, when he gets off his Christian bashing and he simply gets into explaining the physics, it almost makes you wishing for more, because it's so fascinating, so interesting, and so wonderful to learn. If this was true, then at a fundamental level, this is from page 159, nature would be able to distinguish right from left. See, the human created distinctions between them, between right and left, would then not be totally would not then be totally artificial. He says it in a difficult way, but you get what he's saying. These distinctions between left and right become extremely important in dealing with spin and what have you. He quotes another physicist who says that I refuse to believe that God is a weak left-hander, which is a horrible thing to say, but I get his point, what he's trying to say, that physicists had a hard time believing that left and right had significance in what they were studying, and turns out it really did. So that was quite a surprise for the physicists, I guess. He introduces other physicists and their developments that they did. He introduces, again, that protons and neutrons are made of more fundamental particles, which this gentleman, Gell-Mann, in the 50s, he called quarks. So they keep getting smaller and smaller particles. So where does it end, right? It's like the universe. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, or they keep finding deeper and deeper discoveries with the Space Webb Telescope or the Hubble Telescope. Where does it end? They don't know. Where does the tiny particles, what are quarks made of? They don't know, right? It just keeps getting smaller and smaller. It's infinite. You could say it's infinitely, keeps going down in one direction and keeps going infinite in another direction. You know, they won't come to the conclusion, wow, God is marvelous. Instead, they'll just keep chasing their tail and chasing their tail. And does it result in improving our lives and bettering humanity? Absolutely. Of course it does. Of course it does. They've contributed amazing things to our society and to our civilization. And he finishes the chapter by at least admitting that on page 166. He says, what's the significance of neutrinos? And he says, we don't yet know, right? Even though our very existence, which derives from the nature of known forces, it derives from unknown forces. We don't know the full characteristics of God. We've never sat down with God across from us, and our existence comes from the unknown. It comes from the spirit realm, right? Adam became a living being because the breath of God was breathed into him, but he doesn't get that. He just thinks that it's all due to the nature of these subatomic particles and the forces that dictate their reality is what dictates our reality. And in the physical realm, he's right. It is true. They're discovering the nature of our reality, while at the same time they're missing the forest for the trees. They're abandoning anything to do with the metaphysical. They're abandoning God, and they think that they're going to solve all the world's problems simply through their own efforts of physics, and anything that involves the metaphysical or asks God for help, they reject. They don't want anything to do with that. They don't want to hear about it. They'd rather just ridicule it by putting a scripture at the beginning of every chapter and then using it to poke fun or whatever reason they have behind it. I was thinking in one of my videos that perhaps that's the only way they get published with a big publishing house is by including anti-Christian sentiment, which is so pervasive in the world today. You can see where it comes from. It's in so many different books, in so many different areas. I've been reading books on politics. I've been reading books on science. I've been reading books, all kinds of nonfiction titles, and you can see that anything published in our lifetime, I would have to say that the majority of them include anti-Christian sentiment, and it's really unfortunate. And nobody says boo about that type of Christianophobia, if you want to call it that. That term is not even a familiar term because nobody mentions that term. There's no such thing as hatred against Christians because it's simply acceptable, because they know that Christians are taught to turn the other cheek. Christians are taught to not be offended when people ridicule you, and instead to bear it as a badge of honor, because that shows that we're trying to please God, right? It says those that would please God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. The world abandons that concept. The world does not want to diligently seek God. They think, well, if God is there, let him show himself. They say the same sentiments that they hurled against the teacher when he was hanging on the cross, right? They say, well, if you're so great, then prove it. They don't get the big picture, and it's sad. It's a shame. It's unfortunate. How much greater would the advances in science be if there were more and more scientists who diligently sought God and said, God, please reveal to me how I can help the world, how I can help discover how reality works. How much more advances would we make? But they're stubborn. They say, we're going to do it all on our own efforts. We're just going to use human effort and he's proud of this human effort, how courageous it is and how brave it is. And sure, in some sense, it is admirable that they have diligence and put in this effort to understand reality, and that's nothing to be denigrated unnecessarily. Of course not. I don't want to bash them just for the sake that they're participating in their studies without God. I just feel that it's a shame that they didn't add God into the mix and say, God, help me, bless my efforts so that I'm able to contribute even more. And this is the point I'm trying to make, is that they've Lisa Randall and Lawrence Krauss have abandoned God. And where has it gotten them? Are they household names? Well, they may be, and yeah, they may win a Nobel Prize someday, and I hope they do, and good for them. But I believe, sincerely, how much greater achievements they would make if they would humble themselves and ask God to help them in their efforts, because it is fascinating stuff to see the amount of studies that they're doing. Sorry for the background noise. There's some work going on here. But thank you very much for watching. We finished up until chapter 12, and the next video we're going to press on forward. We're about halfway through, so we're going to get through this pretty quick. So thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I pray you have a wonderful day, and I hope that you're interested in physics too, and that you're going to help solve all the world's problems in one way or another, hopefully with God, right? Thank you for watching. I love you very much. You have yourself a great day, okay? Talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.